On Monday Night Football, we will see the Chargers take on the Indianapolis Colts in a game that quite potentially could lock in the Chargers' playoff spot. Now, like we do every single week, we're going to be going through some of the keys to success and what the Chargers need to do to succeed this week. So, if you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. But let's not waste any more of your guys' time. Let's go and get right into things. Now, as mentioned, this week, the Chargers will be going up on Monday Night Football against the Indianapolis Colts, which honestly definitely have not lived up to expectations for the Colts. They were entering this year quite potentially being a Super Bowl contender, similar to what the Chargers are, but have fallen a long way from what they were expected to do. So the Chargers, entering this game at 8-6, are in a spot that they could potentially move to 9-6, and as we're going to talk about here in a second here, could even get a playoff spot locked in this week. Now, if you would like to see a full coverage on the games you should be rooting for, the teams you should be rooting for, and what the Chargers need to do to make the playoffs, I have a full video on that I uploaded just a couple days ago, but we're going to be talking strictly about this Chargers versus Colts game. Now, as mentioned, the Chargers currently sit at 8-6, while the Colts sit at 4-9-1. And with a Chargers potentially clinching the playoffs this week, this could be one of the most important games of the entire year. I mean, yes, there's still 3 weeks remaining, 2 more after this week, including the Rams game and the Broncos game, but if you get it figured out now, that could allow you a lot of room not only to rest some of your players in the final week of the year, but also maybe take a couple risks with your playbook calling on offense. Maybe try to figure it out, because Joe Lombardi seemingly has not done that yet, next week. Maybe he can take some risks, throw in some plays that maybe he's a little bit worried to do in a game that has meaning, such as this one this week against the Colts. But what do the Bolts need to do to prepare for this week's game against the Colts, and what do they need to do to win this game and move on to 9-6? Well, first, I think the most important thing here that we need to talk about is the fact that the Colts have lost one of their best players on their team, and by far their highest producing player on offense. That, of course, being Jonathan Taylor. Now, the Colts offense has not been great for most of the year, passing or running the game, run ball, and with the one of, if not the best running backs in the entire league, outside of maybe Christian McCaffrey and Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor has been very good this year, even with a very, very slow start to the year. And he's been dealing with a lot of injuries. And now, of course, he's been placed on IR and won't be participating in this game. But even with his great participation and how well he has played after a slow start, the Colts still only sit at 25th in the league in rushing yards. Now, of course, with Jonathan Taylor out due to, honestly, I don't remember what it was. I think it was like a high ankle sprain, I believe is what it was. And he was put on IR because, of course, only 3 weeks left. And a high ankle sprain takes about somewhere in the range of 3 to 6. We just saw the same with Mike Williams. Him being on IR leaves you with, your backup running backs in an offense that already seems to be struggling, quite a lot. Now, going up against the Chargers' poor run defense, currently sitting at 28th in run defense, the Colts, they still may have a slight advantage, even with their backups. But let's take a look at who the backups are and how well they have produced this year. We're not going to be taking a look at the past, but currently this year, how has their backups produced? And that's what we're going to be looking at without Jonathan Taylor, of course, playing this week due to being on IR. Now, the Colts will then need to lean on their running backs in Zach Moss and Deion Jackson. Now, these two running backs have not seen a lot of time, even with Jonathan Taylor being a little bit banged up throughout most of the year. Now, these two combined throughout the whole year have combined for only 400 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown. 400 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown. That is not great by any means. Now, of course, these are backups, so it's not terrible, but these guys in total, individually, have about 200 rushing yards. We have seen top performing running backs find a way to do that within one game, but these guys have done it over a whole season. So that means the Chargers will have an easier task this week, especially having looked at this a couple weeks ago when it looked like a grueling RB setup. I mean, we had Josh Jacobs followed by Derrick Henry, and then you also have, of course, Jonathan Taylor. Now, there was definitely a tough game against Josh Jacobs. Derrick Henry did quite well. Of course, the Dolphins game was in the middle of that. They don't have any incredible rushers. But then you looked at this Colts game and Jonathan Taylor, and there was still plenty of worry that even with a poor Colts offense, that Jonathan Taylor would be enough. Now, with him out due to IR, this Chargers offense or defense may have a little bit easier of time going up against this Colts offense. Now, for this reason alone, the Chargers should hopefully be able to lean a little bit more on a balanced approach on defense. Now, we have seen some struggles, even against some lesser-known running backs, and the Chargers have allowed decent amount of yards. I mean, we've seen that year after year, but even this year we've seen some less-known running backs, whether they are the starter that week or the backups, have a pretty good game. So hopefully we won't see that again this year, but for the Chargers' success, I think they just need to kind of stick with what they've been doing. They held Derrick Henry pretty low. I think he had just a little bit over 100 yards. Now, you're not going to hold Derrick Henry under 100, especially with that poor rushing defense, but they definitely stepped it up. Sebastian Joseph-Day's return was, of course, a big help. The linebacker room has done a great job in run defense as of late. I mean, Drew Tranquill and Kenneth Murray. And, of course, you have some interior guys that have been doing great. Fiocco, Austin Johnson, of course, is out. But he was a key piece to this when everything was working at the right time. So things are starting to kind of figure themselves out on the run defense approach. So the Chargers should, be a little bit more balanced. I think they have enough where they can do well in the run defense by just, base defense. And then keep up with that man-to-man out there on the side, as we've seen a lot the past 2 weeks. But mix in some zone, mix some things up, bring some blitzes, because Jonathan Taylor is out, you're able to kind of change some things up a little bit here and there. So, next topic here we're going to be covering is a change at the helm for the Colts. Now, of course, not only have the Colts lost Jonathan Taylor this week due to injured reserve once again, but now they will be changing their quarterback. Matt Ryan has been benched now for the second time this year. This time, though, for Nick Foles. So, this is a whole different script. We haven't seen Nick Foles play at all this year. I think he only played one game last year, so it's a little bit hard to game plan for because we don't know how much things have changed in the past 2 years, especially with him being a lot older than the last time that we saw him play a long amount of games. So, it has been, a while since he's played more than 2 games in the season. Last year, I think he only played 1, and before that, he played somewhere around 7. So, as mentioned, it's a little bit harder to game plan for a guy like that. But the Colts currently sit at the 15th in passing yards, right at average. But of course, with a new quarterback once again entering the fold, it's going to be hard to get things clicking right away and for them to manage what they're normally consistent at doing. And especially with Jonathan Taylor, the Chargers defense is hopefully going to be able to lean a little bit more on the passing approach, which is once again going to limit Nick Foles' amount of yards, not only from a little bit of rust, but also from the Chargers defense game planning. So, let's look at the past 4 years for Nick Foles, excluding this year, of course, because he hasn't played it all this year. But let's look at some of his stats. Nick Foles is 3-9 through the past 4 years, and has not been great at all. If we're being honest, 3-9, it's not terrible. We've definitely seen worse, but for a Chargers team going up against him, that's certainly a good thing to see. Now, for actual statistics, player stats, that is. Through 4 years, I've combined all the stats for the past 4 years to come up with he has averaged 6.4 yards per throw. That honestly is pretty solid. You're getting a first down every other play. That pretty solid. Now, of course, I think that's definitely going to change with the amount of rust that he's going to be having. He averages an 87.96 passer rating. Now, I'm not a huge fan of passer rating nor QBR, but for the people that are, I think that is an important stat to look at. 87.96 certainly isn't good, and it's not anywhere near the highest level that it can be. And he averages 202 yards per game. 202. Now, that definitely isn't terrible. We've seen Justin Herbert, just about reach 400 a couple weeks ago. We've seen plenty of quarterbacks over the past years, average over 300, or at least close to. But 200 isn't terrible, if we're being honest. But over such a bigger group of games, I think it definitely brings it down a lot. When you've played 12 games for the past 4 years and you're averaging 202, you're definitely limited on what you can do with your offense. I mean, to have 200 yards or 202 yards a game or two here is one thing. But to average that, which means you're going to have some games over and some games below, means that there's some really low lows at times. Games where he's having somewhere around 120, 150 passing yards, which is not a good game at all. Now, he also averages 1 touchdown per game. Now, that's going to limit the Colts' production on offense by a lot, especially with Jonathan Taylor being out. If you can only get 1 touchdown passing, and where are the rest of those coming from, especially with backup running backs? I mean, you're not going to get too many points from your offense if that's all that Nick Foles can bring. Now, with that being said, the Chargers' pass defense has looked a lot better the past few weeks. Of course, man-to-man defense has been a big priority. Michael Davis, I think, leads the league since week 12, maybe. I'm not sure. There's some week, since a certain week, I'm sorry for not knowing the exact number, that he leads the league in pass breakups with, I believe, 10 at the current moment. So, he's definitely been doing very, very good, and a lot of that comes from being man defense. Asante Samuel Jr. has looked amazing. Again, the linebackers have been great in run defense, but also in pass defense, and we're going to be seeing, hopefully, the return of Derwin James. He was a full participant earlier today, and potentially yesterday, with today being Friday is when this is being recorded, and yesterday, I can't remember, he was limited, and then he was a full participant, but I don't remember when I looked at the sheet if that full participant was today or for yesterday. Of course, likely that he'll be a full participant as well tomorrow, but Derwin James' return is definitely going to be a huge factor, and that's something we're going to talk about just in 1 second here. But what should the Chargers do to hopefully succeed going up against Nick Foles? Well, remain keen on the man defense. Focus in on that. It's been working great, so don't change it up now. Yes, use some zone defense, change some things up, but if it's been working, you don't have to change it. Now, Michael Pittman, who is their current wide receiver 1, definitely isn't on the same level as some of the wide receivers the Chargers have seen so far this year, and especially when they were just going against Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. I think both those guys are better than Pittman. Now, Pittman is honestly a very good wide receiver, but I don't think he levels to that amount. So, if we can stay with this man, bring in some zone, I think the Chargers can limit the production from their wide receiver 1, and I think that's just going to, domino down the way to the remainder of the wide receivers on this roster. Now, I do think the Chargers need to diversify some of their coverage packages. With Nick Foles, having some rust, it'd be good to maybe confuse him a little bit. Throw in some plays where it looks like he's definitely zone, but all of a sudden it's man. And vice versa. Bring some blitzes, bring a lot of pressure, drop back and bring limited pressure. Just really throw Nick Foles off a little bit, especially early on. Throwing him off early could be enough to cause some long-term effects throughout most of the game. So just, yes, lean on your man defense, but also be willing to diversify some things. Throw some weird packages in there to potentially confuse Nick Foles. And although he's already shown to be a great quarterback, he's been a Pro Bowler before, it's always weird, trying to knock the rust off. I mean, we saw that with Deshaun Watson. Maybe not such a great topic to cover here, but he was a Pro Bowler. He was, at one time, a top 10, top 5 quarterback based on many analytical analysts. Now, in the past 2 weeks here, he has looked very poor, at least the bottom half of the league in quarterbacks. So potentially, if the Chargers can take advantage and throw him off a little bit, and Nick Foles, we could see, a limited amount of production here. Now, we spoke about Derwin a little bit, and that's what this whole topic's going to be about, and that's Derwin's return. Derwin James has been dealing with a quad injury that has forced him to miss the past 2 weeks. Of course, against the Dolphins and the Titans, but with being a full participant the past day here, and hopefully tomorrow, and he'll be able to play, I think he could change up a lot of things, maybe not change up, but improve a lot of things for this Chargers defense. In his stead, since he's been absent, we've seen the Chargers defense take a big step up, not only in run defense, which I think they did a lot better in, but even in pass defense. I honestly think the past 2 weeks, pass defense, they've looked better than they did the entire year, even when at full strength with Joey Bosa, with J.C. Jackson. I don't think the Chargers have looked better passing than they did the past 2 weeks, especially against that Dolphins team. But with Derwin returning, I think a lot of these things could improve, but my biggest worry is that with the return of Derwin James, they might, go back to what they had with Derwin James. And that's what I'm hoping they don't do. I hope that they stick with what we've seen recently. Use that man-to-man defense because Derwin can do very, very good in that, but mix in some of these zones. And because this defense has done really, really well as of late, diversify what Derwin can do. That was kind of the big thing. Derwin James can bring so much to this team. He can be your jack of all trades. Get back into that. Make him do all this sort of stuff. I mean, man defense has been working without Derwin. You've got, it seems like the D-line has kind of figured out what's going on with pressure. It felt like they could get no pressure a couple weeks before, and now the past 2 weeks, they've been getting consistent pressure and some sacks, and from guys that aren't expected. I mean, Khalil Mack, I think, has won through the past 2 or 3 games. It's been a lot of other guys working and making it work. The run defense has definitely improved. Interior D-line, of course, Sebastian Joseph-Day's return was a big factor, but linebacker room and Drew Tranquill and Kenneth Murray also got a lot better these past 2 weeks. They were good all year, let's be honest, and Drew Tranquill was in the hunt for a Pro Bowler. Of course, Pro Bowl has come out, and only 2 Chargers made the starting, but, that's a topic for another video potentially. But, stick with what's working and add Derwin James to it. The Chargers' best chance on defense this week is to get Derwin back into the fold, get him involved as close to full as you can. Of course, you don't want to push him too hard with just coming off injury, but, diversify what he can bring to this team. Use Derwin James to bring pressure off the edge. Get some more sacks, force him towards Khalil Mack, Nick Foles, of course, and bring some more pressure. You also want to, bring him into the box. Use him as a linebacker, in your blitzes or drop back. You go man to man with tight ends, with wide receivers. Bring a lot of diverse looks, and don't limit Derwin James or the defense. Find a way to make them both work together. I think that's a huge factor in this Chargers game this week, but especially through the remainder of the season and even into the playoffs. Speaking of playoffs, the Chargers have a chance to clinch a playoff berth. Now, as mentioned, I did cover a whole video on who you should be rooting for this week, and not only to help potentially clinch this week, but also for further hopes and even for potential matchups for the playoffs for the Chargers. But I think it's important that we do kind of cover who, not who you should be rooting for, but what games are most important for clinching scenario. So the Chargers at 8-6 could move to 9-6 with a win on Monday Night Football, and under the right circumstances, they could clinch a playoff berth with 2 weeks still remaining in the year. Now, of course, with the Chargers playing on Monday Night Football, all this would occur before the Chargers game, and potentially, if the Chargers win, they could clinch by themselves if everything else plays out prior. But of course, the Chargers win is the most important, because even if they don't clinch, it will raise the chance of them making playoffs next week, and so on and so forth. I think they're already pretty close to a 90% chance of making playoffs as it currently sits. Now, with Herbert not having seen the playoffs quite yet in his career, hopefully this year will be the year, and the Bolts having dealt with so many issues, coaching issues, injuries, poor performances, all this stuff that's kind of transpired so far this year, the fact that the Chargers could make the playoffs this week, guarantee their spot this week with 2 weeks still left, is absolutely crazy to think about. But what are the scenarios in which the Chargers could clinch? Now, there's 3 different scenarios where the Chargers could clinch. Of course, all of these include the Chargers winning. That is by far the most important scenario here. But there's a couple other factors that can go into this thing. So scenario number 1, Chargers need to win. Las Vegas Raiders need to lose and or tie. New England needs to lose, and the New York Jets need to lose. Now, of course, the Jets already lost to the Jaguars yesterday. So one factor of this thing is already checked off for scenario number 1. Scenario number 2, Chargers need to win. Las Vegas needs to lose and or tie. New England needs to lose. New York Jets need to tie, which of course they already lost. So they did worse than that. So this is still checked off. And Miami needs to lose. So of course, once again, we have one of these checked off, and actually better than what needed to be done here. And the third and final way for the Chargers to clinch this week is a win once again for the Chargers. Las Vegas needs to lose and or tie. New England could tie in this scenario. The Jets need to lose. Of course, this already happened. And Miami needs to lose. So all these scenarios, we've already checked off one of these things. So the Chargers could clinch this weekend. I think that's super, super important and super crazy to think about. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and move on to predictions. Now, of course, I think you guys kind of realize I'm not a huge fan of predictions because things can go over the place, especially with score predictions. But I'm going to say my predictions for this game. I think the Chargers defense, when going up let's be honest, not a great Colts offense, but I think the defense will look pretty solid. I think there will be at least 2 turnovers, one being an interception. I think the Chargers will force a fumble on one of the backup running backs for this Colts team. At least 2 turnovers. I wouldn't be surprised if there was more, especially with a rusty Nick Foles and, new running backs instead for Jonathan Taylor being absent. I also think the Chargers offense hopefully will start to get the click. Now, not because of Joe Lombardi. I still think Joe Lombardi should have got fired a long time ago, and I still am on that. Maybe not so much with the chance of a playoff berth. I think that's a little risky at this point of the year, but he definitely needs to at the end of the year. No matter what happens, Joe Lombardi needs to get fired from this team. But I do think the offense starts to get some things rolling. I think Herbert will likely break 300 yards once again. I think he's going to get some touchdowns this week. I am going to say, and this has been a long time since this has happened, Herbert currently needs, I think, 10 touchdowns to break the record for most touchdowns through the first 3 years of someone's career. I think Herbert this week will get 3 passing touchdowns minimum. I won't be surprised if he gets 4, but I'm going to say 3 minimum because I think 1 could potentially go to Herbert, but I feel like they'll probably hand off at least 1 to Austin Eckler. I think that's a pretty fair assumption there. And, the final prediction here, of course, will be the score prediction. My score prediction for this game is, I think, a little bit basic, a little bit normal. I don't want to overdo it because I feel like that's a consistent thing that happens. It's always way off. Predictions are always so sporadic and so different than what actually occurs. But I will say, the final score will be 31 for the Chargers. I think at least 4 touchdowns, and then that field goal would get you to 31. I think it's going to be 31-17. I think the Colts will find a way to get 2 touchdowns. Not sure how. I think probably at least 1 will come from Nick Foles. They'll find a way to get it, whether it's good field position, a missed field goal, or however it may occur. I think they'll get at least 1 through the air, and maybe they'll find a way to get another one on the ground, and then a field goal. So 31-17 is my final prediction for this Chargers-Colts game on Monday Night Football, with the Chargers advancing to 9-6 and hopefully clinching their spot in the AFC playoffs this week. But what are your guys' thoughts on this game? What do you think are the keys to success for the Chargers? And what is your final score predictions, as well as who do you think will have the best game this week? Now, you, of course, could go with Justin Herbert. That is obviously a great option, but who are potentially some other pieces you think is going to have a big game? Who may cause an interception or a fumble? Who may have a big game with over 100 yards? What are your thoughts on that? If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. It truly means the world to me. But with all that being said, I hope you touched some today. Hope it made you smile, hope it made you laugh. Something really important to me. Affects someone else today in a great way, because every single day can be a great day if we all just put in the effort. And as always, you guys all be safe out there.